My husband was actually on a flight once with an emotional support pony,
Whoa, that's pretty
which
good.
was wearing a diaper,
Wow.
which I guess is better than the alternative.
That is
But yes,
that is not a true story.
it is absolutely a true story.
Wait, you mean like a Shetland pony?
I don't know. I wasn't on the flight. It was some little horse thing.
Yeah, that's a Shetland pony.
Okay. Either way, should not be
That's
on a
like
plane with humans.
Little Sebastian from Parks and Recreation. This is Impromptu with Washington Post Opinions, a show where we bring you conversations about the issues we can't stop thinking about. I'm Charles Lane, Deputy Opinions Editor, and this week we're talking about air travel and why the whole system seems so fragile these days. There's delays and cancellations, but also exasperation with the always changing boarding procedures, the increased cost of checking bags, or needing to pay to get a seat that isn't cramped in the back of the plane. Southwest, the one commercial airline that was holding out against priority boarding and more premium options, announced last week they're changing tactics. Why has airline travel gotten so miserable, and is there anything to do about it? I'm joined by two of my colleagues to discuss.
I'm Catherine Rampell. I'm an opinion columnist. I mostly write about economics, public policy, and related issues.
And I'm Marc Fisher. I'm also an opinion columnist. I write primarily about the Washington area and the kind of the meaning of Washington, D.C., but kind of range around, and this week writing about Southwest.
So yes, last week, Southwest Airlines made news announcing that they will start assigning seats and offer premium seating that has more legroom. The company had stuck with its open seating policy ever since it had gone into business in the 1970s. Do you guys think this change was inevitable? Does Southwest have to do this to compete with the other major airlines? Let's start with you, Catherine.
I'm actually, in some ways, a little bit surprised in that I thought that there were people who liked this particular arrangement, and that's why they were loyal to Southwest. It does differentiate, or has differentiated, the airline from its competitors. And now what's different about it? Why would you choose to fly Southwest over another option, particularly if the seating is comparably priced?
Mark?
I don't think they needed to do this unless they were faced with the situation they are faced with, which is that their profits were down about half in the second quarter from the same period the year before. So if that's their main goal, it's to pack the livestock into their tin tubes as quickly and bloodlessly as they can in order to make more money, to get things moving faster, then sure, they had to do this. But really, they didn't have to do this. And it is an elemental shift in their philosophy. When they started out 50, 60 years ago, Southwest specifically presented itself as being there to democratize the skies. That was their phrase. And so their whole pitch was, we're all about everybody having equal access. And that meant equal access to the best seats, too. And so if you could game the system and check in exactly 24 hours in advance, you would get the seat of your choice. And it had nothing to do with how much money you had or how much money you were paying them.
The airlines make billions each year on, quote, extras, things like baggage fees, premium seating options. All those things used to be sort of things that just went with the ticket. Now they're unbundled. Does that actually have value for customers? Does it give people more choice?
In theory, yes. And so if you subscribe to that whole notion of dynamic pricing and all of the unbundling, I mean, you end up in the absolute hellish circumstance of Spirit or Frontier, where everything is a separate charge. I was on a flight on a budget airline to Iceland last year, and they didn't bother even having cushions on the seats. It was just the raw seat that's delivered from Boeing.
The raw seat. I like that phrase. I never heard that before. The raw seat.
And so that fight to the bottom, that's where you end up. It was sitting on a metal seat and having to pay for water. And, next you'll have to pay for the vent over your seat.
That sounds like going to a Commanders game at FedEx Field. You sit on a metal seat and they make you pay for water.
The unbundling is, cynical attempt to say that you're having more choice as a consumer. And yes, if you're 23 years old and traveling with a tissue instead of luggage, then sure, you can get a much cheaper flight on Spirit and be insulted at every step of the way. But for the average passenger, the unbundling just means paying more money and getting it zapped to you at the end of the process rather than with it getting a price up front.
Well, Catherine, you are sort of the resident economist or economics columnist. I'm surely you have a little more sympathy with this effort to harness incentives.
Yeah, I don't have problems with, this kind of price discrimination. And I think it does enable airlines to offer very low price point options that they might not otherwise, which gets people access to services that they might not otherwise have. My complaint is about the transparency. So I don't have a problem with airlines charging more money for different amenities. But I do think that all of that information should be disclosed up front. And there has been some regulatory effort over the years to make sure that happens, like when travel aggregators like Booking.com or Kayak, et cetera, when they index different flight options, they have to include the taxes and fees. Whereas you can, some airlines in the past would have said that, they're only showing the fare price, not the taxes and fees, even though the taxes and fees are required.
Yeah, I agree. I think transparency is a huge issue for me. We live in the age of the teaser price for almost everything. And I have to admit, I'm a sucker for the teaser price. When I see, I can get to the West Coast for $59, I click on that and then I realize, no, that's not really what I'm going to pay. Let's shift gears a little bit just to like the physical experience of flying and psychological experience of flying. I mean, Marc, I'm not going to say how old you are, but like me, you're a little tiny bit older than Catherine. And how has the experience changed over the course of your lifetime?
To go back to the ancient era before Jimmy Carter deregulated the airline industry, when you and I were younger, Chuck, prices in the air were pretty strictly regulated. And as a result, the airlines competed primarily by services that they offered. Comfort and quality of food and quality of seats and the amount of leg room and all of that, and the boarding process as well. Then Jimmy Carter said, I'm going to deregulate this and prices are going to come down. And we did have a little period there of actual price competition. And there were discount airlines, People Express and New York Air, or you could choose Trump Airlines and get, leather seats and maybe even get to your destination. And so there was this sort of moment of flowering of choice. But very quickly, with the exception of Southwest, the other airlines decided that they were going to move into this dynamic pricing era of unbundling and all of that. The dream of the deregulation has really been lost. You have these exceptions of like Spirit that are still competing on price, but Southwest's move now tells us they're not going to compete on price, and they're really not going to compete on service either. And so you end up with this business that feels like a monopoly because they treat their customers like dirt. Yes, prices are lower than they would have been otherwise, and clearly Americans value that more than almost anything else. I think this is, it's a great economic experiment because what it shows is that price is the determining factor, and we will take any indignity they throw at us in order to get another $8 off the fare.
Yeah, so I think they're only competing on price effectively at this point. And I think airfares are actually remarkably cheap, particularly when you inflation adjust for whatever comparable tickets would have been a couple of decades ago. I can fly one way from New York to California, if I time it right, for like $100, $120. That is insanely cheap when you think about like everything that goes into that flight, and everything that goes into making that trip happen. So I think the issue is that's what consumers care about. They are sorting by price. If consumers cared about the other stuff, like how they are treated, or, I don't know, how comfortable the seating options were, then airlines would respond to that. But they don't. This is what passengers pay attention to. I know so many people who say, like, never again on Spirit Airlines. And then it's like, okay, it's too cheap to pass up. So they do it again. And I think part of what has happened here is that, there's been sort of a race to the bottom on pricing. Fares have gotten very cheap. Coupled with all of that, you have the fact that in like the first decade of this century, airlines overall were losing money. They lost a lot of money. And at some point, around 10, 15 years ago, there was this movement within the industry towards what has been called capacity discipline. So that means essentially that they are flying much fuller flights. So rather than selling out, only 80% of the flight, they're selling out close to 100% or sometimes over 100%, and they're overbooking. That cuts different ways. So you have fewer seats, but a higher share of those seats actually being occupied. That's very good for airlines, right? It's good for their profits. If the planes are full, it's expensive to fly a half-empty plane a few hours. It keeps their costs down. And I think that's partly what enables them to keep offering cheaper and cheaper tickets. It's a little bit, counterintuitive.
You made me think of this, Catherine. If you were to ask me personally how the experience of flying has changed the most since I started flying, 40, 45 years ago, it would be that you never get on a half-full plane anymore.
Right.
Back then it was quite common to be one of 20 people on a flight that they just couldn't book. They have really, with the help of sophisticated computing and so on, they've really optimized what you call capacity discipline.
Right. Yeah. So what happens is that means that can make the tickets cheaper on average. But if something goes wrong, people get screwed, right? Because it's not like you can just hop on the next flight where they have a bunch of empty seats. That's why you get these big pileups and delays where if your flight gets canceled, you might have to wait not just hours, but potentially days, as we have seen with this recent CrowdStrike issue, because there just is not a lot of redundancy built into the system.
And I spent 24 hours in the Seattle airport last winter for precisely that reason. They had nowhere to put us after a cancellation. And so it was a total mess. And I think that they actually do this sort of on purpose because I think there is a perverse joy that or pleasure of some sort that a lot of passengers get from being treated like dirt because it makes them think they're getting a deal. If they were showering you with decent service and actually having customer service people at the airport during one of these giant pileups, then you would think, well, they're spending all this money on that. I could get a cheaper fare if I go to the airline that treats me like dirt. So I think that
do you seriously know anybody who likes being treated badly by airlines?
Jerry Seinfeld built an entire career out of airline jokes about exactly the stuff we're talking about.
But that's because people hate it.
People love to hate it.
Mark, hold on. Mark, do you think one of the reasons they give so little legroom in sort of, ordinary coach is like a business strategy to get people to pay more for a little more legroom?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, they used to have customer service desks at the airport. They still have the desks. They just don't have any people there. And I think that is one way that they show, hey, look, we're economizing in order to give you these low fares.
All right. We're going to turn to more constructive topics like what could be done to repair or improve the system. But first, we need to take a quick break. Welcome back. I'm Charles Lane, and this is Impromptu. So the Biden administration is attempting to rein in airline problems. They have new rules that will require automatic refunds for canceled flights. more transparency around baggage fees, among other things. Do you think there are any rules and regulations the government is not enforcing that it could enforce that might make air travel better?
I'm basically on board with the things that you mentioned that they're already doing, that they are enforcing more transparency and they're helping customers get redress when things go wrong. And those are my biggest complaints with the airlines. But the idea of requiring them to build more redundancy into the system so that when things go wrong, there are more options for passengers. I think that's the implicit solution to some of what we've been talking about. I think that could go very badly in the sense that, yes, when things go wrong, you might have better resolutions. But if you require more redundancy in the system, if you require, for example, airlines to run with more excess capacity, that will probably, in the long term, push prices up. So a lot of the solutions that I hear bandied about or that are implicit in the things that people are complaining about, I think might have unintended consequences.
I agree that a lot of the fixes would drive prices up, but I think those prices would be more honest. And I talked to an economist at the University of Kentucky who spends his life studying dynamic pricing and queuing theory and stuff like that. And he said the only answer here is to re-regulate, is to go back and establish certain floors and ceilings of pricing for airlines, and that this would help consumers and would actually help airlines because they'd be able to set clear prices that they could depend on and actually plan on. And yes, they'd be somewhat higher, but they would actually reflect the cost structure of the airlines, and they would actually reflect what many passengers are already paying once you add in all the absurd fees.
So some people say part of the problem is just consolidation, right? I mean, there are 5 major airlines at this point, and they've taken over, merged with 42 others since 1960. That's even before deregulation. Is this an antitrust thing where we need to sort of break these companies up? Would that serve any purpose?
I have very mixed feelings about this. There has been a lot of consolidation in airlines, but there have also been a lot of airlines that went broke. And it tells you it's a really hard business. Part of the problem is, while there have been new entrants, I recently flew an airline that I had never heard of called Breeze. The newer entrants, like that one, basically can't get slots at the major airports. Like you could, if I wanted to create Catherine Rampell Airlines, it would probably be very difficult for me to get a slot for a major route from LaGuardia or JFK or SFO or any of those other airlines. I only have the option, essentially, to go to some of the further away regional airports, which fewer people use. And that makes it more challenging. And there are probably different ways that you could, I don't know if democratize is the right word, but you could make it easier to have the legacy carriers compete over those slots in the high demand airports that would help the new entrants gain more of a foothold. But I don't know necessarily that breaking up the airlines absent evidence that, I don't know, that they're really abusing their pricing power for, if they've really monopolized one particular route, for example. I don't know that that's going to be super helpful because, again, prices are very, very low. I think it's good that more Americans at lower income levels are able to fly.
Let's get your takeaways. What's the big picture takeaway, Mark, after all this griping and a little bit of constructive discussion?
The nation's airways are like a bargain basement department store. It's a place where you can get a lot of cheap prices and you don't really know what you're getting, but it'll probably get you there eventually. And at the same time, it's a miserable experience. And whether it's intentionally miserable or accidentally miserable, it's miserable. And so I think a lot of Americans would be open to some basic structural changes, except they'd be so fearful that prices would go up that they'd say, no, treat me like dirt. That's what I really prefer.
Catherine?
Again, I am skeptical that people like being treated badly. I guess what I would say is we have a very congested system. Again, no slots at the major airports. Airplanes are very full. It would be better for each of us individually if fewer people traveled, right? Like, we would all have a better experience if we were competing with fewer fellow passengers. But in aggregate, it's a good thing that a lot of people have access to inexpensive travel, even if that experience often leaves much to be desired.
I confess, I am an apologist for commercial aviation, and let me tell you why. A lot of people start the narrative with deregulation in 1970. I started with the invention of commercial aviation in the 1930s, when it was prop planes at low altitude. Inside, it was noisy. You could hear the engine. It was freezing cold. The person sitting next to you was chain smoking with the encouragement of the airline. By the way, that's another thing that's changed in our lifetimes. There's no more ashtrays. And as you say, Mark, it was a miserable experience reserved only for the wealthy few who could afford it. Now, at least, we have this fantastic jet service that serves everyone, not just a wealthy handful. It's extremely complex, capital intensive, and everything else. And they pull it off with more safety than ever. I checked, and the last time a commercial airline went down in the United States was 15 years ago. So in other words, 2009. Before that, it was 2001. The safety of this extraordinary complex system is kind of mind-boggling when you really think about it. So yes, all of these annoyances are real. I repeat, I can't stand the boarding process. I hate it when somebody clonks me in the head with their overhead luggage. But when you consider how far we have come within a century, it is pretty staggering. When I think about the alternatives, I always come back to my experience flying in communist countries. I flew from Havana to Camagüey, Cuba once, and it was on an old Soviet Ilyushin jet. The plane was packed, and I looked up ahead of me in the cabin, and the fire suppression equipment was attached to the wall, and it included a fire extinguisher and an axe. An axe, just in case we needed to chop our way out of a fire. And this axe was held on by a lightweight vinyl strap and one button to this wall. So off we go down the runway. And sure enough, at the very last minute, the pilot has to abort the flight. And we come to this screeching halt. And I heard this loud noise, and I looked back, and sure enough, the axe had, gone all the way through the cabin and come to rest at the back with a loud clunk. So yes, government regulation is necessary, but in countries where they do a little bit too much of it or they do it stupidly, it can create unintended consequences. And with that absurd, lengthy anecdote, we have to wrap this up. Thank you both for being a part of this week's episode of Impromptu. Let's do it again soon.
Thanks, Chuck. It was a lot of fun. I want to go back on Aeroflot so I can get beer in a can with a glass, made of glass. And yes, a goat and a dog in the seats next to me.
Thanks, Chuck. Always a pleasure, even if airline travel is not.
We've got one more thing before you go. Here's a quick word from our humor columnist, Alexandra Petri.
Alexandra Petri here. Folks, what's the deal with airplane travel? Sorry, I just always wanted to say that. Here's what I'll say about airplane travel. Airports are majestic hubs of wonder, and I love them. I say this as someone who once spent all of Christmas Eve in Chicago O'Hare with a toddler, hoping to get onto a flight to Salt Lake City using standby. Even then, I was like, well, no matter what, at least we're in an airport. My husband did not share this enthusiasm, but I stand by it. You can do everything worth doing in an airport. You can eat sushi. You can sit in an uncomfortable chair. You can visit something that describes itself as a bookstore and buy The Secret. You can pay $13 for one water bottle. They even have fun places shaped like planes for your toddler to climb and run around. The airport's great. It's when you get on the plane that things get bad. If you want to feel better about the regular experience of airplane travel, try traveling with a toddler. Mine, for instance. Seriously, take her. I'll fly separately and pretend not to know you. I will take any middle seat you offer me, even if the person in front of me is reclined into my lap and the person behind me is kicking me. This is gravy compared to traveling with a toddler. Usually, when a baby on your plane starts to cry, you think, I wish that crying baby on the plane would stop. Somebody is parenting wrong. But when it's your baby and that baby starts to cry, not only do you have a better front seat to the crying than anyone else on the plane, but also everyone's glowering at you as though you're personally responsible for the baby crying and have just made it do so to spite everyone on board. It's no good explaining that, actually, I want this to be happening even less than you do. They feel that you have the power to stop it, and yet they see that you are not making it stop, and consequently, they hate and resent you. The lack of legroom is the least of your problems. With a toddler, not only are you stuck in a middle seat with no legroom, but also someone sitting on your lap and screaming and spilling orange juice on you, and then you're sticky and wet and smell like orange juice for the remainder of the flight. And this is just traveling with one kid. I can't even imagine what it's like traveling with two or more. In my opinion, they should not just let those families board sooner. They should also just let the plane take off with them and give them the flight to themselves. That would be fairer for everyone involved.
This episode was produced by Hadley Robinson and edited by Damir Marusik, Chris Sulentrop, and Allison Michaels. It was mixed by Emma Munger, and Chris Rucan designed our art. Special thanks to Millie Mitra and Travis Meyer. Thanks for listening to this episode of Impromptu. As always, let us know what you thought of the conversation and what you think we should talk about next. It probably won't be axes flying through airplanes. Email us at impromptu@washpost.com.